All right, ready to dive deep into the world of heroin.
Yeah.
We've got some seriously interesting sources to dig into. We're talking the Wikipedia article on heroin, a blog post reviewing the novel Heroine,
Okay.
excerpts from the novel itself,
Right.
and even a teacher's guide for using it in the classroom.
Wow, so we're really going deep.
Yeah, we're going all in on this
Awesome.
one. You think you know the basics about heroin, but then you stumble across the fact that
Or aspirin bear.
exactly, Aspirin Bayer was marketing heroin as a cough suppressant back in the late 1800s.
Seriously.
Totally serious. They even put it in the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Like it was no big deal.
And get this, they were promoting it as non-addictive.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine?
It really makes you think about how much trust people put in science back then, right? Like, was there no skepticism at all? Did people just accept everything they were told?
Yeah. It's like a collective forgetting of all the potential downsides that come with new discoveries. You know, it's a good reminder to always stay critical, even when it comes to scientific breakthroughs.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, but let's get down to the science of what makes heroin so addictive. It's made from morphine, but what's actually going on in the brain when you use it?
So heroin acts as something called a prodrug. It basically gets into the brain and then transforms into morphine. And then that morphine attaches to these things called opioid receptors. Imagine them like, I don't know, little docking stations in your brain specifically for opioid molecules.
Okay, so I'm picturing tiny little docking stations. Then what?
Well, when the heroin turns into morphine and plugs into those receptors, it triggers this whole chain reaction, like a flood of dopamine, the pleasure chemical, creates this intense euphoria, and it also blocks pain signals and reduces anxiety.
So it's like hijacking the brain's reward system.
Exactly.
You feel amazing, but at what cost?
Well, the immediate downsides aren't great. Drowsiness, nausea, vomiting even. And then the biggest one, slowed breathing.
Right.
Which is what makes heroin so dangerous, especially when you factor in that street heroin often has, like, wildly different purity levels.
So you never really know what you're getting.
Exactly.
And that's a huge part of the overdose risk.
Exactly. And long-term use. That's when things get really bad. It actually changes the physical structure of your brain. It messes with your neurons and hormones in ways that are really hard to fix.
No wonder it's so hard to break free from heroin addiction.
And then there's tolerance. The more you use, the less it works. So you need more and more to get that initial high. And of course, you become physically dependent. So quitting comes with these awful withdrawal symptoms. It's a really brutal cycle.
It's scary how easily a substance can take over your life like that.
Yeah.
Which is why this novel, Heroine, caught my attention. It follows this high school athlete, Mickey Catalan, whose life falls apart after a car accident leads to opioid use.
I've heard of that book.
Yeah, the reviewer mentioned this one really disturbing scene where a mother overdoses in a Dollar General with her toddler trying to wake her up.
Oh, gosh. It's chilling.
Yeah, it really shows you that addiction can hit anyone, anywhere.
And this novel seems to go deeper than just the surface. It really digs into the psychology of addiction.
Yeah, the psychological stuff is always the most interesting to me.
So we have this promising young athlete. How does she end up in such a bad place? What's going on in her head as she gets more and more addicted?
Well, the teacher's guide has some excerpts that give us a peek into what she's going through.
Okay.
For instance, we learned that Mickey is adopted, and she seems to have this deep feeling of emptiness. And on top of that, there's the pressure of being a star athlete.
So the accident, the painkillers.
Yeah.
It's all a way to escape, to numb the pain. Not just the physical pain, but the emotional pain, too. Exactly. And the way she justifies using is heartbreaking. There's this one line where she says, "Every time I pop a pill, I'm doing it so that mom has a kid she can be proud of. I'm not taking Oxy because it makes me feel good. I'm taking it for other people."
Wow.
It shows how messed up her thinking is because of the addiction.
It's tragic how addiction can twist your own thoughts like that.
It really is.
But before we get too deep into Mickey's story, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
This whole non-addictive marketing campaign from Bayer. Knowing what we know now about heroin, what do you make of that? Did they actually believe it, or was it something more, I don't know, shady?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely makes you wonder about the responsibility of these pharmaceutical companies, right? Especially when profits get mixed up with public health. It's something we still see today. But that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah, good point.
Let's stick with Mickey. What happens to her as she tries to deal with this addiction? What choices does she make? How does the novel show her inner struggle?
Mickey's story, it's sadly not that unique. It's like a reflection of this whole global crisis,
Right.
this massive web of heroin production and trafficking.
It's hard to even grasp how big it really is. Like, where does most of the heroin on the streets even come from?
A lot of it, unfortunately, comes from Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
Yeah, back in 2004, the UN reported they were responsible for something like 87% of the world's heroin.
Wow, 87%?
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
And it's estimated that about 100,000 people die every year because of Afghan opium.
That's awful. So how did it get so bad there? I mean, it's not like Afghanistan was always the world's heroin hub.
Well, it actually goes back to the early 1900s when countries started cracking down on opium and heroin production.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as it became illegal, boom, a black market pops up to meet the demand.
Classic forbidden fruit, right. But who were the big players in that early black market? A lot of activity was happening in China, cities like Shanghai and Tianjin.
China.
Yeah, these triad gangs took advantage of the political instability at the time, setting up labs and shipping out heroin to all the countries where it was now outlawed.
So basically, organized crime swoops in to fill the void left by prohibition.
Exactly. And the routes they used were, like, super intricate, always changing. We're not talking about small-time smuggling operations here. This was a massive, well-organized network.
So beyond addiction and health risks, what are the real-world consequences of this global heroin trade?
Well, it destabilizes entire regions. You get corruption, armed conflict, it messes up economic development. It's like adding fuel to the fire in places that are already struggling.
So it's not just individuals who suffer, it's whole communities and even countries.
Exactly. And often, the countries where the heroin's produced, they're the ones who get hit the hardest. The violence, the poverty, the breakdown of social structures. It's a vicious cycle that's super tough to break.
So what can we even do about it? How do you tackle a problem this big and complex?
It's definitely not easy. It takes a multi-pronged approach. There are international efforts to crack down on production and trafficking. Law enforcement agencies are trying to dismantle those criminal networks, seize shipments, disrupt the flow.
Sounds like a tough job.
It is. It's like a constant game of whack-a-mole. But there's also a growing focus on reducing demand.
Okay.
Investing in things like prevention programs, education, treatment.
But those programs don't always get the funding they need, right?
Yeah.
And there's still so much stigma around addiction.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. But even with all the challenges, there are some new and innovative approaches coming up.
Like what?
Remember we talked about heroin-assisted treatment, or HHE? It's been gaining some traction in Europe as a harm reduction strategy.
Right, the idea of giving pharmaceutical-grade heroin to long-term addicts in a controlled setting.
Exactly. It sounds a little counterintuitive, I know.
Yeah, at first I was like, wait, what?
But the results in places like Switzerland are pretty impressive. Crime rates among the participants go way down. They can stabilize their lives, reduce all the chaos that comes with addiction.
So instead of constantly chasing their next fix, they have a safe and reliable source.
Right. It takes away that desperation.
Makes sense.
And because it's all supervised, it cuts down on the risk of overdoses and the spread of diseases like HIV and hepatitis C.
So it's about meeting people where they are.
Yeah.
Offering a way to a healthier life.
Right. It's not about condoning drug use. It's about acknowledging that addiction is real and offering a practical way forward.
Definitely something to think about.
Definitely.
Let's switch gears for a minute and talk about the economics.
Okay.
We talked about organized crime, but what about the street level? How much does heroin cost?
Yeah.
And how does that impact people?
It's tough to give an exact number because prices fluctuate based on purity, location, demand, all that stuff. But to give you an idea, in Europe, brown heroin can go for as low as 14.50 euros per gram in Turkey. But then in Sweden, it can be as high as 110 euros.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is. White heroin is even more unpredictable, with prices all over the map.
So how does that compare to the U.S.?
The UN estimates that in the U.S., it's typically around $172 per gram.
That's a lot of money.
It is. And that can really push people to desperate measures to fuel their addiction. You know, poverty can drive people towards drugs, and then the addiction makes it almost impossible to escape poverty.
It's a terrible cycle.
It really is. And it just highlights the need for, safer and more affordable options for people who are struggling.
Are there any new treatments being developed?
Yeah, scientists are working on finding ways to manage pain effectively without the risk of addiction.
Okay.
And they're also developing medications to help people get over opioid dependence and deal with withdrawal symptoms in a less painful way.
That's good to hear. But going back to HAT, why do you think there's so much resistance to it, even when the evidence seems to show it works?
I think it boils down to the stigma surrounding addiction. People are afraid that providing heroin, even in a controlled environment, is like saying it's okay to use drugs.
Right.
It goes against the idea that abstinence is the only acceptable outcome.
It's like we're so busy judging that we miss the chance to find real solutions.
Exactly. HAT challenges us to think differently about addiction, to move past punishment and towards compassion, to see people as individuals who need help, not as criminals.
And isn't that what we should all be striving for? A society that helps instead of judging? But let's get back to Mickey.
Yeah.
We know she reaches out for help, but what does that look like? How does the novel portray recovery? We've talked about the science, the history, the global picture, but sometimes the best way to really understand something like heroin addiction is through the eyes of someone who's actually lived it, right?
Absolutely. Stats and data can only tell us so much. It's the personal stories that really hit home.
And that's where the novel Heroine comes in. Remember Mickey Catalan, the high school athlete?
Yeah.
Her life takes this dark turn after a car accident leads to opioid use. It's like it all starts so innocently.
That's what really got to me about her story.
Yeah.
She's just trying to manage her pain after the accident. It could happen to anyone.
But then it's like the slippery slope. One minute you're dealing with pain, the next you're caught in this addiction.
And for Mickey, the addiction gets all tangled up with her sense of self.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's this part in the teacher's guide where she talks about how using drugs makes her good at hiding things. And it's not just about hiding the drug use, it's about hiding her vulnerabilities,
Yeah,
her insecurities.
So the addiction becomes like a coping mechanism.
Exactly, a way to protect herself from the world.
But that's not really a solution.
No, it's a dangerous illusion. The drugs might give her temporary relief, but the more she uses, the more everything else in her life starts to fall apart.
Her relationships, her dreams.
Everything. There's this really powerful line in the teacher's guide where she describes using heroin as finding her mother. Like she's searching for something to fill this emptiness inside her, and she finds it, tragically, in the drug.
It really shows how addiction can be tied to these deep emotional needs.
Yeah, there's always a bigger picture, Often it's about trying to numb the pain instead of actually healing the wound.
And the way she justifies her drug use,
Oh, yeah.
it's constant. Like she's trying to convince herself it's not a problem.
Classic sign of addiction, right? The way it distorts your thinking.
Yeah.
The brain gets so good at twisting reality to fit the addiction.
It's scary how it can take over your mind like that.
It's insidious. It often happens so gradually that you don't even realize you're losing control until it's too late.
The novel really captures that. We see Mickey lose friends to overdoses, and it still doesn't stop her.
There's this intense scene where her best friend, Carolina, confronts her. She asks, "Why you and not me?"
Heavy stuff.
It's a question that anyone who's seen the effects of addiction has probably asked themselves, right? Like, why do some people get trapped and others don't? It's tough. There's no easy answer.
I guess it just shows how complex it all is.
Yeah, it's this whole mix of genetics, environment, personal circumstances. It's different for everyone.
And it reminds us that addiction isn't about weakness
Exactly.
or a moral failing.
It's a disease. It can happen to anyone, no matter who you are, how smart you are, how strong you think you are.
But there is hope, right?
Yeah.
Mickey eventually reaches out for help. She starts on the road to recovery.
That's such an important message. Recovery is possible. It's not easy, but it's possible.
It's not always a straight line, though, is it?
No, there are setbacks, relapses, doubts along the way. But with support and a real desire to change, it can happen.
And that's where compassion comes in.
Yeah.
We need to be there for people, not judge them. Create a society that helps people recover, that gives them a second chance. Mickey's story is a reminder that addiction is a disease. It needs treatment, not punishment. And to wrap up this deep dive on heroin, we've explored the history, the science, the personal stories. It's been a journey, for sure. And hopefully, this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this complex issue. We encourage you to keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep the conversation going. Until next time.